today's final panel is tackling some of these more transit-oriented questions. Of course, improving transit for all is also a core strategy for achieving some of our equity goals and making sure that we aren't leaving folks behind as we transition and transform our transportation, so that all communities are relying less on fossil fuel-powered vehicles. These are really particularly hard goals to meet, especially ones for those of us who have lived a long time in California and Los Angeles know, especially ones that involve getting people out of their cars and into forms of public transportation. The state's been trying to do this for quite a long time and has so far not yet succeeded. But I'll emphasize the yet, and part of what we're going to talk about in today's panel are policy tools to get us further in this direction. We have a really fantastic panel with us today. I'm excited to introduce them. I will say we are down one panelist who had to withdraw because of illness. I'm sorry that we won't have Alfonso Directo from ACT LA with us, who was scheduled to be here today but had to withdraw. But I'm really thrilled to introduce the remaining two. So to my far right is Maddie Brozen. Maddie is the Deputy Director of the UCLA Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies and a transportation researcher. Her research focuses on transportation needs for vulnerable populations and on how transportation connects people to opportunity, most recently focusing on transportation needs related to healthcare. She previously managed UCLA's Complete Streets Initiative, and she was the founding editor-in-chief of Transfers magazine. So welcome, Maddie. Thank you for joining us. And then Bryn Moncelsi is to my right. She's the Deputy Director of Climate Resolve, a local organization many of you may know that works on climate issues. There, Bryn leads, among other things, the organization's work on transit issues. Bryn's worked in Copenhagen as a policy analyst and sustainability expert, on Capitol Hill as a member of Senator Klobuchar's environmental policy team, and with the New York City Department of Environmental Protection. So with that, I'm happy to hand it over. I think Bryn's going to kick us off with some foundational information about California's goals in this space, some updates on how we're doing on those goals, and ideas for what should come next. So thanks, Bryn.
Thanks, Cara. So as Cara said, our prompt for today was to discuss some of the promising and durable policy tools. So I think, I'm going to get into, and how do I use this?
So push the
green button to advance. Okay. There we go. So I'm going to start by discussing some of the canon, the kind of the heavy hitters of policy tools that have really been guiding us in a more smart growth direction, and discuss some of the shortcomings where they're not quite hitting a home run yet, and tweaks we maybe can be looking to make there. We would look for the legal community to help out with, and then get into more kind of how those policies are trickling down and affecting some of our local approaches and local decision making. So we've heard from CARB, the California Air Resources Board today. Our kind of fundamental what's setting a direction for how we can be reducing climate emissions and hitting some really important climate targets is AB 32. Fran Pavley was in the House earlier today, so hats off to her for really leading this piece of legislation. But it's charting the course. It's our roadmap for how we reach Paris level climate targets. It's changed. It's become a little more ambitious over the years, but the current kind of end goal there is carbon neutrality by 2045. It starts by looking at a greenhouse gas inventory, seeing where all our climate pollution is coming from by sector. And it probably isn't a surprise to the people in this room that our transportation sector is our largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. So there's no way we can ignore that or kind of fall short on that sector and still meet our climate targets. When we look at our transportation sector, the strategies that we need to be pursuing, as Cara said, it's not enough that we're just changing over what our cars run off, that we can't just be electrifying transportation. We call these the three legs of the stool. for the transportation sector. So we're both kind of changing what the fuel source is made up of. We're greening that fuel source by decarbing the electric sector. But then we also really need to be reducing the amount of driving, the amount of vehicle miles traveled that's taking place too. And so, if you think about this, it's kind of common sense. Like, we are trying to turn over more parts of our systems of production, more parts of our economy to be electric-based. But we can't just always be like driving up that demand for greener power. We need to also be cutting some of the demand for the power. And so that's what that trying to reduce vehicle miles traveled is getting at. So again, it's kind of looking at like maxing out. If we max out, we're getting to a point where we're going to be having all the cars on the road cleaner sourced. But still, what do we need to do to reduce driving? And those targets are there in that like 25% to 30% range. So again, that's kind of like a North Star to be good, to making good on our climate targets. That's the amount of driving reduction that we need to see. So think of that as like 1 in 4 people changing their commute from a driving commute to a transit commute, right? That gets us to that 25% target. It doesn't feel too crazy, but as you'll see, we're not quite.
It's pretty crazy.
Go to Copenhagen. No, it feels doable to me. So how are we doing, though? We are not quite on the right track. If you start with the graph on the left, that's kind of economy-wide. We met our 2020 target as a state for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but we are not quite on track to be hitting those later goals. Then the middle graph is kind of looking at what's happening within each sector. You'll see the electric power sector, they've been reducing emissions there. That one's headed in the right direction. But again, transportation, that largest source of emissions up at the top of the chart, is taking a rise again in emissions, right? We are not headed in the right direction there. The far right chart, again, it mirrors that transportation curve in general, right? And that is showing that our amount of driving that people are doing on a per capita basis is on the rise again. So something's not adding up to kind of take us in that direction of meeting our targets. Our next kind of big piece of guiding legislation that's really had an impact in transportation decision making was SB 375. Steinberg was the author there. And that kind of is trying to filter then down from a state level to a regional planning level. So we have our 6-county metropolitan planning organization here, SCAG, Southern California Association of Governments. It does a regional transportation plan, sustainable communities strategy. This plan, the idea there is that we are looking both at our transportation infrastructure investments. Where are our transportation dollars going? Are they still going towards highways? Are they starting to make transit and active modes better? What are we investing in there? How is that picture changing? And then also our land use zoning. So where are we building? Is it still in a sprawl direction? Are we densifying? How dense? How affordable? So looking at those land use patterns. And then policies as well, such as congestion pricing or high occupancy vehicle lanes, those sorts of things. And how does this all add up? And it's supposed to get us, they're supposed to chart the course of kind of how these factors can all add up to be reducing driving in the way that we need to hit those state level targets, right? Well, in actuality, we're still seeing sprawl. Even our latest version of our regional plan still has growth in that outward direction. And it's a kind of a no-brainer that the further out you build, the harder it becomes to serve transit and serve those commutes to jobs. So it's not a winning strategy for trying to reduce driving, that's for sure. We are still seeing highway lane miles get added to the system. We haven't really changed course there yet either. And kind of what's behind that, I'll say, this process of forming these regional plans, it really is like a bottom-up compilation of county lists of projects that they want built. They give that to our regional planning, metropolitan planning organization. SCAG then does some black box modeling kind of and outspits them saying that, oh, we're meeting our targets. And trying to decode what is going on in that black box, I'll say that there's a big reliance on road pricing kind of at the end of the day. So remember I said it was investments, land use, and then policies. That policy piece is carrying a lot of weight here in how our region is saying that it's going to meet its climate targets. And all for seeing some shift towards a more road pricing-based mechanism, but it's kind of slow going. It's not picking up a lot. So I think there's still a lot of room for improvement in those other categories too, right? In our transportation investments and land use. Moving ahead, another really important piece of legislation, SB 743. Again, Steinberg was the author here. Has changed how we look at then at a project level. So if we, said we tried to filter down from state targets to regional planning, but that regional planning was still really a bottoms-up list of projects. So now if we try to get at the project level of kind of how decisions are made there and what rises to the top as a good idea and makes its way onto those project lists, SB 743 is trying to get at kind of what we think of as a successful project that's environmentally sound. So it changed when we look at the transportation impact in CEQA analysis, so environmental impact reporting. It used to be something called level of service, which was saying if a road's congested, that's getting like an F grade, that's doing really bad. And then the kind of like having our blinders on perspective of how to fix that, how to improve that impact would be to widen the road or right to get those cars flowing. Was kind of seen in the old paradigm of how to improve that metric. And this piece of legislation is now having it that we're taking a little bit broader perspective and realizing there's been study after study that have shown in congested urban areas such as Los Angeles, you really can't widen your way out of congestion. So there's this nifty calculator that's based on a bunch of studies of real projects. The 405 widening is a kind of classic case here. And it shows that for every kind of new amount of road space you're adding to the highway system, just as much new driving fills that road space. So it's a ratio of 1 to 1, an elasticity of 1. It really doesn't work to try to widen our way out of congestion. So this now looking at vehicle miles traveled as the metric of impact is looking at like if you're creating a big box store out in a sprawl development and that's creating new driving, that is a negative impact overall, right? Even if it's like spread out driving, but trying to look at the big picture of that when we have these kind of driving dependent investments and land use patterns, we're not headed in that direction of being able to reduce our driving. So it's a really important piece of legislation. It's still, I'd say, getting worked out, kind of how it's being implemented. Something I would like to see here right now, we still have the threshold of significance is up to local jurisdictions to set kind of what VMT impact they're going to call significant or not. I think we still have room for improvement there to try to align it with those CARB VMT reductions of 25 to 30%. We're not there yet. There's a lot of places that are setting the threshold of significance as no impact, so like VMT neutral, they're calling good enough, but that's not going to be enough to kind of get us on that VMT reduction curve, right? A little more kind of on that, like if we can't widen our way out of congestion, what can we do? So I think we need to have a little mindset shift here, that we have a lot of roads out there. We have our public right-of-way where there's an opportunity to be seeing better people throughput rather than vehicle throughput, which is what we've been optimizing for in the past, and it hasn't quite gotten us to a better mobility future. And so this is a diagram here showing that maybe parking on this taking up the full length of the sides of the roads is not the best use of space, of public space, in our real heavily trafficked arterials. So we can rethink a little bit how we use that space, be creating dedicated transit lanes, dedicated bike lanes, and really be improving the people throughput. So in the transit planning world, there was an unpopular phrase some years ago called road diets, when we take away space from cars to create more space for other modes. But I'm a bigger fan of a term road buffet. We like different options for people out there, different mobility choices. What's that? It's nice to not need to have to drive. I'm going to move on. So if this is sort of one of the kind of visions for how we can try to get to that reducing driving curve, get on better track there, is be shifting what our road space is used for. Another shift that we need to see happen is kind of the color of our money, what we have, what we're funding in transportation investments. And so historically and currently, both at the federal and state level, you see an 80-20 split, with about 80% of it going towards roads, highways, supporting cars, and 20% being split between transit and active modes. And so that's what's really led us to the disparities we see in mode choices out there, where it's not appealing to people to take the bus that they have to transfer 4 times on or something, right? Because we haven't invested in that bus network to make it a better choice. So, there's work being done at both scales, at the state and federal scale, to try to change the color of that money. Again, I think there's room for more ambition there. So a lot of times some of these new programs that are being set up, again, are kind of aiming for that, like portfolio-wide, VMT neutral, and you still have a lot of opportunity then for highway widening projects to be a part of the mix. And as long as we're kind of fueling fire with one hand and trying to put it out with the other, we're not going to be getting where we need to on that reducing driving curve. I will say, to a point on kind of where this funding is coming from, a lot of it is gas tax based. And so there are challenges there with kind of proving that the people that are benefiting from the use of that revenue, there's often a tie needed there, right? So if people with gas cars are the ones paying the tax, there's a belief that they're supposed to be the ones benefiting. So there is some of that like dichotomy of what can investments go towards, and seen as like road space reallocation not benefiting car drivers. So I think there's an opportunity there, maybe as we transition away from a lot of our transportation investments coming from gas tax towards road pricing, road usage, that there's more of an opportunity there maybe to be having active disincentives for solo driving long distances, and still trying to get sort of tiered fee structures to not overburden low-income communities. I will also say in that kind of where our transportation funding comes from, transit operation funding is the hardest to come by. There's still more like bond money out there, capital infrastructure funds that make kind of the shiny ribbon cutting type projects a little easier to fund than the ongoing, like putting buses out there to run and have better service levels. All right, shifting vein a little bit then to locally. I serve as sustainability chair, elected chair of the Sustainability Council at Metro. So I've been pretty in the weeds of kind of like what does sustainability look like at the agency there. A lot of it is kind of, when we get to this county or local level, on a voluntary basis. Those state mandates aren't quite trickling down into really having to change the calculus. And so I will say it's been an active advocacy space. We don't quite have those state mandates working in our favor at that scale yet. But in 2019 was the first time that Metro's Climate Action Plan began to look at both sides of the ledger. Previous iterations, they would kind of put out this report of how everything they're doing to be putting out transit service and creating options for people is having this positive climate impact. And they'd be looking at their own fuel sources and how they're having a positive impact there, but they weren't counting the added emissions that were coming from their highway widening part of their portfolio as well. So this was kind of an initial step, was to get them to look at both sides of the ledger and do that kind of full accounting of their full impact. Here's what some of this advocacy looks like in trying to stop that highway widening from happening, trying to shine a light on that it's not just some sort of fringe issue, that this is a real significant part of the portfolio. There's still billions of dollars that are programmed for kind of old legacy, old thought of ideas that were in this old planning paradigm, and thinking they could fix transportation issues by just widening. And this still can feel like a game of whack-a-mole, kind of local advocates trying to kill these projects. We don't quite have that policy vision of kind of saying we're not gonna widen anymore. We don't quite have that from a top-down scale yet, but working on some of that culture change. Then a board directive led to the creation that the agency should set some vehicle miles traveled reduction targets. So in 2024, we saw those targets get adopted. They looked at kind of different scenarios. One is kind of what's already adopted, how much further could they go. When they still didn't get to the point of any of these scenarios not including the highway widening projects. So, I think we would have liked to have seen a scenario 4, where we're actually trying to get to that CARB level goal of 25 to 30% reduction in driving, because all of these scenarios didn't quite get us there yet. But it's at least something for them to start having some awareness of how it's all adding up. Another recent development, just 2 months ago, in February of this year, we started seeing a VMT impact statement in all board reports that are going before the Metro Board. Again, just kind of trying to get it more into the zeitgeist, more into the consciousness there of how all these decisions have an impact on the amount of total driving out there on the roads. One last development I wanted to share about locally. Metro has been leading the way on developing a VMT mitigation bank. And so this is how they are doing their local implementation of SB 743, when they are now looking at their highway widening projects and they see that there's a VMT increase there. They have to then mitigate that impact, right? And so this has been their way of trying to think of ways that they could be making those out to be like VMT neutral projects. And so they've looked at having a bank kind of where fees could be paid into. VMT increasing projects could add to their cost, the total cost, by paying into this VMT mitigation bank, and then it could fund other projects that would reduce that amount of VMT. I'll note kind of the options they're looking at in the pilot project so far in the pilot program, bus-only lanes is proven to be the best bang for the buck. A little bit of kind of where this bus-only lane idea came from and how that could be a promising way to be improving mobility options out there. Metro engaged in a next-gen bus plan to realize that this is a large workhorse of our local transit system. It serves a lot of people every day, and it could be doing a better job. So there was some kind of consolidating of routes to be able to run more frequent service there. But the kind of high-level conclusion was to be able to get more frequent, more reliable service. We need dedicated lanes out there so buses aren't getting stuck in the same traffic that everyone else is, and transit signal priority. So they're kind of, when they're approaching a signal, they are getting that green light. So really trying to speed up and make that bus service better. One last note I want to share, just kind of on our local context. So we realized we can't just be putting more buses out there into traffic and make a difference. But we also found that in trying to increase service levels on our bus network, there was a real hiring shortage and retention issue that was preventing us from being able to increase service levels. And so some of what came out in kind of a survey of bus drivers at the time of some of the stressors that was leading them to leave that workforce. There's a list here, so low pay, and I would point out that a potential solution there is to be having more of that transit operations funding that's so hard to come by. They noted that weaving in and out of traffic was a real stressor on the job, and so I think dedicated bus lanes could help us out there. They noted that incidents and confrontations on the system with folks who were having sort of mental health episodes was a real stressor of the job. Happy to report that a new transit ambassadors program is trying to address some of those issues and has been a real success case, really popular, making the system more welcoming, both for riders and for improving this job quality for bus operators. And then a couple more things they noted, that it was stressful to not have like dedicated bathroom spots at their layover destinations. So that seems also solvable, get some agreements going with local buildings. And a couple other things here that their start and the end of their shifts would sometimes change where it was. So they would have long commutes to get to and from work. So if we could have more sort of increases hiring pipeline of bus operators, people could be a little more local and not be asked to do overtime as much, which was also a stressor on the job. So just to kind of wrap up, I think we have some good policy tools at our disposal that do kind of set some direction and help us try to focus on the need for reducing driving. We have some ideas locally of kind of how improvements in the bus network could be achieving a real difference in people's kind of daily cost calculus of what options they want to choose. But we do need to see shifting of funding to help realize more transit operations, more transit infrastructure funding, and we also need our citizenry, our people out there to be a little more accepting of us trying to reallocate road space and create better transit options out there. And lastly, just kind of valuing our bus drivers as real climate heroes out there, giving them good quality jobs. I think that's where I'll stop.
Thanks, Bryn.
Thanks.
Before I turn to Maddie, just on your second bullet related to reallocating road space, or what did you call it, the road buffet approach, which I do agree is much better than road diet. I wonder what lessons you take from the pretty high-profile fiasco in Culver City. Maybe fiasco is too strong a word. Where Culver City undertook a high-visibility project that did, I think, more or less exactly what you're calling for, reallocated a lot of Culver City road space toward transit and active modes of transportation, and then faced a really severe political backlash. And as I understand, it actually had to undo some of the changes that it had committed to. So I wonder what political or other lessons you take from that example.
Yeah. I mean, I think we do have like a network effect situation where if we're just doing a little bit here or a little bit there, we're not really changing people's reality of kind of what options do they have. And so I think we do have a hard road ahead of us of some of these earlier on trying to improve the transit network. And it takes kind of, courage, backbone to stick with it and try to get to that point where we have a more successful transit network that is a more appealing option to people. But we're really, we're starting at a disadvantage. If you look at our road space out there, there's real kind of big mind shift needed of what is thought of as kind of inherent right of car drivers versus other modes. There's a battle to be had.
Yeah, I mean, one thing to point out, just because there was political backlash, the evidence about that project is very clear. It made transit faster. It made more people ride transit. People were safer. Like, just because there's a political backlash does not mean it was an idea that wasn't working. And so I think we need to separate these things a little bit and understand that there's a real big role for political courage. But just because there's a backlash doesn't mean it's not an ineffective solution.
Very well taken, and a nice segue to your conversation about evidence, actually. So what does it show, Maddie?
Great, thank you so much. So my name is Madeline Brozen. I'm the Deputy Director for the Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies. We're just in the next building over. And so, unfortunately, we don't actually do enough conversations between public affairs and law, so it's really great to be invited to join you today. So, as Cara mentioned, I'm going to kind of just talk about some of the strategies we've seen and some of the evidence for how it's working, and then what we need to make these things actually work better in the future. So I do want to kind of just start from a broad picture about how we get around and how there's very different ways that kind of different groups of people travel and what that means for the types of solutions that we need to use. I'll also just talk a little bit about what it means when you don't have transportation and the effects on their lives. Like, I'm a firm believer that we need to meet these state climate goals and people need to have high quality lives. I think we can do them together, but I don't want to have the real daily effects on people's lives get lost in the conversation. So I'll kind of talk about some of these strategies to balance quality of life and environmental and give you some ideas about kind of a path forward. So just kind of talk about, what's kind of the differences in how people get around. So I'm just going to kind of cut this very coarsely by income. So if you look at higher income travelers, they drive for a majority of their trips. There's pretty near universal rates of car ownership and much higher rates of electric vehicle ownership. And therefore, when you own a car and you take the majority of your trips by that car, you then drive more, right? And not only do those people drive more, they actually are more likely to live in places that have higher access of levels of opportunity. You have things that are nearer to you in terms of good quality schools, grocery stores, jobs. So the opportunity is actually to change this group's behavior much easier because you have shorter travel distance that might be more conducive to other ways of getting around besides driving for every single trip. On the other hand, lower income travelers also make a majority of their trips by car, right? There is lower rates of car ownership, higher rates of zero vehicle, but that does not mean the majority of low-income people don't own cars. But they do have also lower rates of electric vehicle ownership. We've seen a lot of lack of progress in terms of infusion of clean vehicle technology into low-income communities. Even when you look at car registration rates among electric vehicles, they might be going into these communities, but they're not going into households that are actually low income. We're just seeing a lot of circulation of electric vehicles among high income people in general. But since you don't have every single person that owns a car, and you also have lower rates we call car access, so you might have one car in a household of 2, 3, 4 adults, right? You're sharing and juggling a vehicle. Overall, there's lower VMT. But lower income people also live in areas with lower access to opportunities. So they actually have to be able to travel longer distances in terms of just getting to jobs, social networks, and other opportunities in life. And so what this means is that the most areas of Los Angeles don't actually have competitive job access rates for people who rely on transit. So what this map is looking at, there's data out there that we know where every job is actually it's a nationwide data set, and you look at for any particular point, how many jobs can I get to from that point in the same amount of time? And so you can look at that by mode. So what this is showing is the ratio of jobs that you can get to in 1 hour if you rely on transit versus you drive. And that dark purple area, the core where the densities are highest, where we have the best transit ridership, the best case scenario is you still have 3 times more of a job advantage when you have a car, right? And so there are real reasons why people need to have cars. And our goal here is to try to close that gap, right? To make the disparity between these modes smaller, and so that you can rely on transit and not be in a disadvantage of the job force and kind of your economic position in the world. And so, I kind of think that we need more nuance in how we talk about VMT reduction in California. I think that we actually need to talk about balancing vehicle miles traveled because people, as I'm kind of making a point, travel very different ways, and it's not like everyone drives the same amount. And so this is going to require that some people drive less, and a bit of a controversial statement, some people need to be allowed to drive more. If we just take a blanket approach that will reduce VMT for everyone, and if I'm a person that doesn't drive very much and I still need to lower that, what does that mean for my quality of life, right? So, and I'll talk a little bit how we get to this by not just meaning that every single person owns a car. Like there are ways we can do this that is not through ownership, but we do need some balancing. And we do also need to do this in a way that makes transit more competitive. Like for the majority of these trips, we need more of them to be on transit, but you can't be at such a disadvantage in the job market. And for anyone, like if you were thinking about how you're getting here today, and you opened your phone and said, well, transit will take you 2 hours, and you have a car in your driveway, like that's not a competitive situation that we have, right? So we do need to look at strategies to actually make sure that transit is not putting you at such a time disadvantage. So what do we need to do to get here? So I'm going to kind of talk about a few case studies and approaches that we're seeing and that folks out of microbe at UCLA and others within the University of California have looked at to kind of help achieve this vision. So I kind of have 3 buckets here. A prioritized approach would think about, how do we manage cars, how do we approach cost, and how do we improve transit? And so the the bottom line is that the best tool to get higher income people to drive less is to appropriately price our transportation system. We have a woefully underpriced and very messed up market that we've created, right? That has very little connection, and especially as cars get more efficient, you have less and less of a connection between how much you do the thing and how much you pay. So that's where road pricing comes in. But for lower income people, I think we need to increase opportunities for car access. And this is not, increased ownership. I mean, there is things, I think, on the technology side, but we're at a point actually in our transportation options that you can buy a car ride one trip at a time and just actually pay for that trip, which enables you to use a car as a tool and not as the foundation of your mobility. In terms of costs, I think for low-income people, we need to provide subsidies and reduce cost barriers and just think about transportation affordability. And I'll talk about an exciting pilot that we have in Los Angeles for that. And on transit, as Bryn was talking about, just thinking about ways to improve transit service and reliability. People, it doesn't matter who you are, if you're a low-income, higher-income person, you ask people what can make service better, and it doesn't matter if you're in Los Angeles or Topeka, Kansas, they say, I need the bus to come more often, and I need it to be reliable in terms of when it gets me there. So the reason why, a lot of these models really work based on road pricing is that road pricing works. So we finally have, in the United States, an example of congestion pricing. We are 3 months into the New York experiment. And I will also say the New York experiment actually kind of got, reduced, right? It was the congestion toll was actually even going to be higher. But in the negotiation of it actually kind of coming to fruition, the toll got reduced. And still, we are seeing that it's reducing cars. 60,000 cars just poof off the road. You have travel times down. You have on-time performance going up. You have transit riding going up. The streets are safer. Fewer people are honking. And by the way, it's raising $50 million a month, right? So there's just not really any tools in the toolbox that do all these things at once. And so here's kind of a chart looking at some bus delay on an express bus in Queens. And so that's looking at how much schedule deviation from before and after congestion pricing. And you can just see that red line that, only now 21% of the buses are more than 10 minutes delayed. So it's just kind of doing all the things. And it's I think it's going to be harder. Hopefully this is building some momentum for this being a possibility in other places. So we look at car access. There are some actually really promising California car sharing pilots. We have one of them here in Los Angeles called Blue LA. There are 1,000 electric cars that you can rent for a short period of time across central Los Angeles. It has a 2-tiered pricing approach. So you have a standard and a community discount. They are placed in areas that are priority population tracks. And there's a really high demand for these vehicles. We did some research, some interviews with people that are members of the service, and they would come up with, they would just really have a strategy to once there was a car, they would have everything they ready to go because if they wanted that, they could really use it. And the other thing that we found in doing the interviews with members is that it was really complementary to transit, is that if you had access to a car for particular trips, you could get a car for 3-5 hours every other week to kind of do your big shops, your errands, for an occasional medical appointment that was really far from where you lived. It made relying on transit much easier because transit did not have to be the tool for every single trip. The problem is that this is still a pilot, and it has a very uncertain financial future. In terms of there's already been 2 operators, the car sharing market in general is very volatile. And, as I'll talk about, we just have to kind of figure out the operations point of this. But we've also seen this actually in the California and the Central Valley called MioCar. It's semi-similar. There's 41 vehicles across 9 hubs in different cities in the Central Valley. Those are similarly located in places where they know people have a real need for cars. They're outside of affordable housing complexes. Colleagues at UC Davis that have evaluated that and said that 63% of the miles driven in that service would not have been traveled, right? So like this shows that low-income people that don't have good car access have a higher demand. Like they have trips they need to be making and they just aren't doing it. So, we would call this good VMT, right? They're in electric cars. They're based on things that people are just buying at one moment at a time. And in these communities, there's no alternative. Like there is not transit service in these communities, right? So it's like this is kind of the only game in town if you want this. But similar to Blue LA, there's a very uncertain financial future, and they've gone as far in that program to look at how fare revenue kind of equates to service operations, and there's certainly a gap. So the other pilot, in terms of cost in Los Angeles, the LA Mobility Wallet program, this is something that's a multi-phase program that was started in South LA. The first pilot wrapped up in spring of last year, about a year ago. The second phase of the pilot has another 1,000 people in South LA and 1,000 people in LA County. These people are getting $150 a month on a prepaid debit card to spend on pretty much any transportation service except for private car. The card is programmed on the back end to just be accepted as certain merchant category codes. My team we've been following people through this program. We interviewed 30 people before, during, and after the first phase, and we're continuing along with our colleagues at Davis to look at people in phase 2. And what people told us is that like having the subsidy meant they just kind of had a new set of options. Like even though, and ideally the design of this was to also couple it with transportation service expansion, that has come much slower to fruition than actually rolling out the card technology. But they were just able to really kind of have stress reduction, improve quality of life. They are traveling more. And, a lot of what we're seeing is that they figured out how to get to their job, how to get their kids to school. But the things they did was making their lives really small. They weren't seeing friends and family. They weren't going to birthday parties. There are just so many heartwarming stories about how this card changed people's lives. They would go to a family event and their family would be like, I never see you, because they just can't get to it. And these are the things that make people's lives really full. And so, we've been able to see in the aggregate about how people are spending this money. And so we look at the number of trips that people are buying, and the majority of them are trips on transit. And about a quarter of these recipients actually already receive a transit subsidy. So they're getting a number of transit rides a month. But this shows that really doesn't go far enough. They still need to buy more transit. But that there's a complementary nature, we think, and we're going to dive into this more in the next phase, that if you can have ride-hailing as a tool, not for every trip, it just makes kind of transit work better, but the cost is very high. And so you need these types of programs for low-income people to be able to access that tool. And so finally, just talking about what do we do on the transit side to make these things work well. I get, frankly, just I got a twitch, I don't know, when they're like, oh, LA's in this transit expansion. We are building a lot of transit. We are not actually increasing the operations of much transit. So what you're seeing here is the revenue service miles by bus and rail over the last, from the mid-90s. And so in the mid-90s, a group of advocates actually, worked to sue LA Metro. And they were successful in actually having a consent decree. And it was pretty similar issues that we'd heard for a while, that they were increasing transit fares, and they were expanding the rail system at expense of the bus system. And this was a convincing argument, and the LA Metro entered into a consent decree. And what you see in that kind of, between those first two bars, is that's how service improved during the period when LA Metro was being monitored by, through the consent decree to actually increase service. And then what you've seen since, even though we've passed these two major sales tax measures, this yellow line is how bus service has improved since the end of the consent decree, right? We're not putting more bus service out on the street, and that is the backbone of our service in Los Angeles, the backbone of pretty much most transit service in the United States. And even on the rail side, we are building more, but we're not really getting tons of new service. So not only do we need to think about, as Bryn pointed out, how do we think about reinvesting the money so we're actually putting out more transit service, but we need other tools so that that service is reliable. You know, as our streets are getting more congested, like the service we're putting out isn't going as far, bus speeds are actually declining. And so, you know, shout out to the work of ACT LA and a lot of advocates in this room that have been working to get these bus lanes, because that is where you're able to actually make those service hours go further. And that's how you make transit more competitive, is that you actually make sure that you have dedicated lanes. There's about 40 miles of dedicated lanes so far in LA County. There's another 55 miles coming on in the next couple of years. But our buses go in a lot of miles of road. And so I think we need to start to think about also, like, not just these absolute numbers of bus lanes, but what percentage of our system is actually reliably moving in this way. Vermont Avenue has been a really big push for the advocate community. And just recently it was approved to actually have BRT. LA Metro also now has the authority to do enforcement of these bus-only lanes. And the bus can actually automatically ticket cars, so we will also hopefully see a more effective use of this tool. But there are 38,000 daily riders on the Vermont corridor that really stand to have a better experience, and so there's hope that this is going to reduce their travel time, and hopefully we'll just kind of see more of this as a strategy for reliability. So just looking ahead, you know, I just want to kind of reiterate to make nuance in the VMT reduction conversation and really think about what types of tools are targeting which types of travelers. To make a point that frequent, reliable transit and car access is the path forward to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Like, ride hailing, I do not think is the direct competitor to transit. Car ownership is. And so if we have a way that we can allow people to not have to increase their car ownership, we are going to have a better chance at meeting our greenhouse gas goals. We need the state to really think about how it's delivering the money to operations. Like, we need to think about subsidies to the bus operations, to car sharing, and to low-income households directly. You know, the road pricing is a very effective tool. We're seeing it in progress. And finally, just kind of one thing I think about, I have a lot of colleagues at our center that work on the housing side. In the last number of years, we've seen how the state has played a huge role in setting goals and putting accountability on housing, right? We said, okay, we know we have a housing crisis. Here's what you need to build. And here are consequences when you don't meet those targets. What is the role of the state in actually having transportation accountability, right? Like, I think hopefully we're starting to see this maybe a little bit in what's called the Transit Transformation Task Force. But, you know, a lot of our transit operators are not maybe used to having accountability on state money. But I think that hopefully there's some compromise that can be headed towards where we say, okay, we're going to give more money for operations, but we expect more in return. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Maddie. All right, I'm going to ask some questions, and I'm going to mix in some of my own and some of the audience's, but I'm going to start with some questions from the audience, and I'm collecting a few together under the heading of, like, future trends and even current trends, and how these current and future trends relate to the idea of reducing VMT. And there are 4 kind of interesting trends that the audience members have asked about. Wondering in particular if they're going to help in this realm or they're going to hurt in this realm, or what your views are on these trends. Okay, there are 4 of them. One is the rise of ride sharing. And Maddie, I think I heard you all in on ride sharing being a good thing from this perspective, but I'd love to hear more about that from both of you. The second trend is the trend in remote work. So, you know, one lasting, seemingly effect of the pandemic is that many fewer of us are commuting as often as we used to our workplaces, and how does that potentially translate into new opportunities in this space, if it does? The third trend is, and I can speak to this one from personal experience, the fact that the next generation seems maybe less interested in driving than prior generations have. I think it's not just anecdotal, but it's certainly anecdotal among my kids and their friends that fewer people are interested in getting driver's licenses than they used to be, et cetera. So what do you make of that? And then autonomous vehicles, all those Waymos that are driving everywhere without drivers. How do all those things fit into this conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I think, ride hailing, I think ride hailing is a tool. I don't want to say that it is not a tool that needs to be regulated, that I think the last panel kind of pointed out how to use incentives to make sure that the cars that are out there are cleaner, makes a lot of sense. And I do think also, like, it can go hand in hand with, like, congestion pricing. So, in a way, like, ride hailing already kind of has price cues in it, right? That, like, there are certain times of day where you're like, oh, wow, that's really expensive. I want to use that. So I think there's a little bit there. Remote work. So LA County had the lowest reduction. I'm going to see if I can get this right. Had the lowest reduction in transit ridership during the pandemic because the majority of our transit riders are people who are not remote working. I do think that this is a call to transit operators to move away from a system that is really focused on 9 to 5, Monday through Friday commuters. After kind of next-gen service improvements and frequency, we do see more weekend riders. And so there's just a point to be made for everyone that you need to, regardless of remote work, like already your system was not really set up to help everyone be able to rely on transit. Like, we need more transit late at night. We need more transit in the weekend. We knew this already before remote work. Let's see, what was the third one? Next gen.
Next gen and autonomous vehicles.
So I have some colleagues that did work on this on, like, millennials. There's a lot of recycling of, I think, thoughts that come around. And it was the millennials were broke. It wasn't that there was a not interest. You just drop things out of your outlook when you don't think you can afford them. And so we saw when the millennials were like, oh yeah, like, are people not interested in driving? Like, once they got money and jobs, what did? They bought cars, right? So, like, I don't think we can rely on peak moments. I mean, we're probably, if there is a recession in the next couple of years, we'll see transit go up. It happens every time, right? It's really connected to the economy. And the autonomous vehicle, it's tricky. I don't love that we have zero occupancy vehicles driving around. On the other hand, I think we have seen, if you have been in a Waymo, that cars can drive way safer than any human can, right? So there is an ability to actually think about autonomous vehicles as a way of, like, people can be in cars and they can drive slower and people can be safer around them, but we do also need to regulate. So that's my quick rundown, and I'll let Bryn add or disagree with whatever.
No, I'll back everything you said there. I think there's all good insights. And maybe what I could add to the picture, I think for both ride share and autonomous vehicles, a promise there is maybe the lack of not as much of a need for parking, right? If we have someone who has their own car and that car sits parked most of the day, we could maybe try to get away from that and create more space for other modes, for dedicated bike lanes, for dedicated bus lanes, and the like.
Thanks. So channeling our missing panelist, Alfonso, who I think would have probably spoken a lot about the issue of improving transit quality, especially for underserved communities. I've heard both of you talk about some ways to improve transit quality, meaning, frequency of service, even simple things like, do you feel safe on a bus? Are the bus stations, shaded from extreme heat? I wonder if each of you could talk a little bit more about other policy strategies for improving transit quality, especially for underserved communities.
Happy to talk about bus shelters. That's been a big priority of Climate Resolves over the years. And that's emerging from, we did, back when Measure M, our transportation sales tax, was getting formed, we were coordinator of the Environmetro Coalition. And our equity pillar there, we started by talking to transit-dependent folks around and sort of asking, like, what would you prioritize investments in? And what came out of that was really a focus on the bus network, service, frequency, reliability there, and infrastructure in the bus network. So wanting shade at stops, wanting safe ways to walk to their bus stops, so that first last mile access. And yeah, so I think, bus shelters, we have a long ways we can go still. We've done some work talking again to transit riders, kind of what features would you like? We still have a lot of hostile architecture out there in our built environment, seats that are not meant to fit all body shapes, that are not meant to be comfortable for a long time, but that means they're not comfortable for a little bit of time either. So, I think we can be adding lighting to make people feel safer when waiting at a bus stop at night. Security call buttons, intercom is a feature we've heard from people they would like. Again, to be doing more of that like nighttime travel that our transit system should be aiming to serve. Things like just having different angles of the shade, because sometimes right now, if you just have kind of one angle of your shelter, that shade patch ends up in the middle of the road. It's not where you're actually trying to be at the bus stop, and so then people are hiding behind a light pole to try to catch a sliver of shade, or kind of running or off, in the shade of a building, and then ending up running to try to flag down their bus, and not in the most safe situations. I think, we see this in like plaza design too. We've built out a lot of the comforts that could be there, trees, shade. So I think as we look to integrate more services like the Transit Ambassador program, where we're trying to approach people who are using the transit system as kind of their living room, our unhoused population. If we try to approach that with programs like the Transit Ambassador program, we can then hopefully get out some of that hostile architecture that then hurts our transit riders as well as our unhoused population.
Yeah, LA Metro has done a really great job of putting women and gender as a focus on their ridership. Half of LA Metro's ridership are women, and so doing a lot of thinking about what types of strategies, understanding the travel behavior better, to make sure that like half the needs of half your riders are being met is a great step. And I think that we both need to think about what's going to draw people into transit, which is a lot of this like frequency, reliability, but also what keeps people on transit, like what makes it so that things aren't a deal breaker. And so a lot of these little things that we see that are just providing, frankly, basic decency, like bathroom access, like bus shelters, like they need to be really thought about as like essential infrastructure, because if you have someone that's trying to get their kid to school, that wants to take their kid on transit, but we make every single trip very hostile to them, like we run the risk of losing them from the system. And the bottom line is those people will buy cars, and now you've just have this sunk cost and asset. So the transit ambassadors are another really great way that we've seen. We have some work that's coming out in the next couple of months, I think, looking at that program. The interesting thing is that like it's the LA Metro, since it's a newer system, was really not designed like to have humans. Like it doesn't have kiosks, doesn't have ticket takers. If you have a problem on the system, you don't really have anyone to turn to, right? And so just having very obvious people that, I think done a great job of having people that connect with the ridership population, just having people to help. I think, we've seen it making a difference in people's experience, and we just need to think about this in many different parts of the system.
Thanks. Okay, shout out to Jo Lu, panelist from Panel 1, for another great question, and it relates to a question I had been thinking through too, about what cities are doing this well and what we can learn from those cities. Joe points specifically to Paris in his question and asks what we can learn from Paris's successes and, conversely, in his words, the failure of Sandag when it comes to land use, active transportation, and the use of mileage-based fees to generate revenue to invest in multimodal plans. I'll broaden the question a little bit and invite you to talk about cities where you think this is going well and what lessons we can learn from them. I know you lived in Copenhagen and you've already brought it up once, not surprisingly, since it's a haven for bicycles and other active transportation, Bryn, so I'm curious if you want to bring in some lessons from there. Go for it.
Sure. So I love the Paris example. I think we see Mayor Hidalgo had a lot of courage there and has kind of stuck with it despite backlash, made really iconic public spaces where it used to be car clogged that are now much more vibrant public communal spaces along the river, and really seen an uptick too, right, in bicycle use and transit use. So it is really kind of a if you build it, they'll come kind of success story in my mind. Copenhagen, again, it wasn't always a bicycle haven. Narrow streets from from a long time ago that they found were clogged, and so they did some like geometry, like we are not going to fit all these cars in here, and made some hard decisions and took away space, even though at one point the majority of commuters of people using those streets were car drivers. And so there's little things like. In Copenhagen, when it snows, they'll clear the bike lanes first, and then get to the car lanes. There is like a deciding we want to use our power to make alternative options, transit, biking, easier, better for people. One other example I'd bring up, I'm a big fan of Barcelona's Super Blocks program, and so that's kind of looking at these neighborhood scale, maybe like 6 block by 6 block, 9 block by 9 block areas, where they're saying maybe we don't need as much through traffic through here. And so they've made it slow speed, like right turn only kind of things. And then they've been able to take a lot of what was the middle of an intersection and put a playground there. I think as a young parent, I think how nice would that be if you could be having tapas and a beer with friends and the playground right beside you, just like more of these communal spaces.
Ellie, it might be tacos, but yeah.
Sure. But just interesting, again, to like rethink of like how much road space do we really need to leave for through car traffic, and what can we maybe start to create different feeling neighborhoods, make it more appealing for people to walk to that local park, that local convenience store, and meet their needs in a non-car dependent way.
Yeah, I struggle with this question because I it's hard for me to find a city in the United States that's doing it well, frankly. There's a lot of reasons for that. I do think that looking at cities that are actually doing well on their housing production is a good place to start. So Austin, Texas has done a really good job at building a lot of housing, and they're one of the few cities that actually has really stable rent prices. So that's I just want to make sure that we're not leaving the housing angle side of this, because when you get people to live closer to where things are, the easier it is to get them around. The only other, I'm from Minneapolis, so I'll shout out Minneapolis because it's like someplace that I go a lot and see. But they've also really led on the housing side. They've made, I just sound like the most annoying person. Like when I'm driving, I'm like, that used to be a gas station. That used to be a gas station. And now they're just, four-story buildings. But in addition, they did have a real backbone of a off-street bicycle network. In the early 2000s, there was actually this federal demonstration program called the National Non-Motorized Transportation Pilot Program, where maybe 4 cities or so got $50 million to actually just go for it, to kind of go big. And so that was able to take their off-street network and complement it with an on-street network of bike lanes. And then, they've really kind of kept going from there. And so there's a lot of really nice, bicycle infrastructure there. They're adding bus-only lanes. They've expanded. So they just I think, looked at this question through a number of different strategies. They also, they've had political struggles in a number of different ways. But the other part of it, I think, that is interesting in the Twin Cities is that there's a very strong regional government. It is probably the Twin Cities and Portland are the 2 cities in the United States that have probably the most well-run regional, kind of the best performance on regionalism. And so that's, I think, something to kind of take into account, is to think about how do we orient our MPOs better in California to make sure that these regional efforts are actually benefiting the big cities. I think we have seen that in the RENA process in terms of making sure that the housing allocation that's coming down to our NPOs is going towards big cities. We saw that, there was a big push before, in kind of the RENA allocation battles of whatever year that was, to, say that we want more housing towards the coast, towards these areas of opportunity. But there's just certainly a role for housing and for regionalism in getting better transportation outcomes.
Thanks. One other reason I really love the Paris example is because, of course, some of that work was done inspired by and ahead of the Olympics that that Paris hosted. And I wonder if there's an analogy to be made here and an opportunity for LA. Lots of folks are talking about a car-free Olympics, whatever that means. And at least one audience member has asked what you think the real opportunity is for Los Angeles to take advantage of both hosting the World Cup and the Olympics in 2028 to help push this agenda forward. And I'll ask one sort of additional, more pointed question about that, which is whose leadership do we need in order to make that happen, assuming those opportunities exist? Is it the mayor? Is it Metro? Is it Sandag? Is it kind of all of us? Is it some combination? Somebody I haven't even named? Like, what needs to happen really on the ground now in order to set the stage for those advances?
I would really be remiss if I didn't shout out Alyssa Walker, who's in the back of the room, and her newsletter, Torched. If you want to stay up to date on everything mega event related, you should subscribe to her, because that's frankly where I'm kind of being able to follow things the best. The car, and I'm just going to parrot a bunch of stuff I learned from Alyssa. But the car-free Olympics is not necessarily a policy choice. It is a requirement because the venues have security zones. So you literally will not be able to drive cars and park. They haven't figured out where baseball is yet. But if they had baseball at Dodger Stadium, you will not be able to drive and park at Dodger Stadium because it's a security zone, right? So, we do have to figure out, just by the nature of what the rules of the IOC has, how people are going to get to venues, whether they get dropped off nearby, whether they get there on the bus. So we have to do it. It's not necessarily a policy choice, but how do we actually orient things? And then frankly, for people that live in Los Angeles, how do we make sure that the improvements that are done for the Olympics and Paralympic Games actually benefit us afterwards, right? A lot of the things, I think, from what I've heard about Paris, is that they did stuff in the run-up to so that the games themselves went well and that people benefited afterwards. And I'm struggling a little bit to see who's in the driver's seat of that. We do have, I've seen kind of SCAG try to play a role. The city's playing a role. Supervisor Horowitz brought together all 88 cities recently. But I think that a bit of the elephant in the room was that, it was for Mayor Eric Garcetti's real, push to get these games. And so there's a little bit of now who's our ringleader moment. And I think there's a great opportunity, but the clock is really ticking.
Yeah, no, I think I'll only add, we did have Garcetti spearhead a 28 by 28 project list at one point, some priorities of them setting this deadline when we need to get some of these transit projects built by. I think what falls short on that is the dedicated bus lane network, the BRT network. Don't see that, really, that speed and urgency there. And so, unfortunately, I think what we're going to see at the games are these dedicated coach bus lanes to get the athletes there on time, but those will go away after the games. Those will be largely freeway network based, so not really serving our long-term transit network. I think we are seeing some organizing around heat, realizing that this is a summer Olympics and we have more extreme heat waves coming, and so trying to see what can be done to get more trees, more shade in kind of the venue pedestrian route access, because as Madeline mentioned, there is going to be a security zone. People are going to have to do some walking to get there. Can't drive in fully air-conditioned bubbles the whole way. And so, I think there's some progress happening there, but a transit network could use a bit more of a push.
Yeah, and we're also just going to need a lot of love to our sidewalks. One of the late Don Shoup's real hobby horses was making sure that Westwood Village had accessible sidewalks, because UCLA is going to be the Olympic village for the Paralympic athletes. And if those Paralympians who use a variety of different mobility devices just can't come down to the village, what are we doing here? And so just want to kind of, uplift that it's not just transit, it's not just these lanes, but it's the streets and sidewalks, because you have to walk into the venue somehow, and the state of those that infrastructure could need a little love.
Okay, thanks. Thanks. I see a bunch more questions. Many of them are very technical. I think we're gonna leave it there and invite other folks with questions to come find you at the reception if you're willing to stick around for a drink. Yeah. And you can join me in thanking the panelists. and special thanks given that we were a man down for stepping up. So that concludes our formal agenda, but we do have food and drinks waiting for you in our sunny courtyard, and still a pretty packed room full of really fantastic people. I can't tell you how happy I am to see so many friends, colleagues, and students and former students in the room. Lots of interesting folks to talk with. So I encourage you to stick with us, join us in the courtyard, and continue the conversation. Thanks so much for being here today. I really appreciate it.